When were you last over here?
1932, wasn't it?
That's right.
For decades, Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy were comedy itself. Their faces, their timing, and the silence between the jokes helped shape the golden age of early cinema. From short films to full-length features, they dominated screens throughout the early 1900s, becoming one of the most recognizable partnerships in entertainment history. To the public, they were inseparable. Where one went, the other followed. That's why what happened next never made sense. When Oliver Hardy died in 1957, the industry gathered, friends came, family came, fellow actors, writers, and collaborators showed up to pay their respects. But one person, the man everyone expected to see most, never walked through the door. Stan Laurel did not attend his partner's funeral. There was no statement, no explanation, just an absence that raised questions no one could immediately answer. What could have happened between two men so closely bound for decades? What could be powerful enough to keep a man from saying goodbye? Join us as we get into all the details. Before Laurel met Hardy, the childhood that forged a comic genius. Arthur Stanley Jefferson was born on the 16th of June, 1890 in his grandparents' house in Ulverston, Lancashire, a small town that would quietly shape the rest of his life. His father Arthur J. Jefferson was already deep in the theater world. An actor and theater manager from Bishop Auckland, his mother Margaret Metcalfe was an actress too, born and raised in Ulverston. Performance wasn't something Laurel discovered later. It was the air around him. He was one of 5 children, including his brother Edward, who would eventually drift into Stan's professional life and appear in 4 Opie short films. But long before any camera rolled, Stan's world was much smaller and much quieter. Because his parents were constantly traveling for work, young Arthur stayed behind in Ulverston with his grandparents, George and Sarah Metcalfe. For the first 7 years of his life, they were his anchor. He didn't just live in Ulverston. He absorbed it. The streets, the routines, the silences. Sundays meant church at Holy Trinity, just off Argyle Street, the same place where his parents had once been married. Faith, structure, and repetition shaped his days. So did small pleasures. Trips to Gillam's General Store on Market Street stayed with him for decades. Beer's TLE toffee bought during shopping runs with Grandma Metcalfe became a cherished memory in January 1950. Long after fame had carried him far from home, Laurel still wrote to family in England about those walks and that toffee. Calling it a big treat and insisting it sure was good. Fishing became his quiet obsession. Laurel would take a rod down to Ulverston's canal, learning patience from his uncle John Shaw. His favorite spot sat beyond the old North Lonsdale Iron and Steel Company near his home on Argyle Street with the railway viaduct from Carnforth looming just behind him. He later remembered swinging on the canal's lock gates while waiting for a bite, passing time the way he would later pass moments on screen with stillness and anticipation. During those fishing walks, he often passed Ulverston Cemetery, where one monument stopped him cold every time. A miniature lighthouse built in memory of Dr. Thomas Watkins Wilson stood glowing, its light once burning all day and night. To a child, it felt magical. To Laurel, it became unforgettable. Years later, in 1932, while standing beneath his own name blazing above a theater in Leicester Square, he still talked about that lighthouse, calling it the 8th wonder of the world and admitting it planted his lifelong ambition to one day have a tombstone with a light on top. That detail alone tells you how his mind worked. As he grew older, Ulverston expanded through movement. Laurel went on frequent excursions from the railway station into the Lake District with cousins, grandparents, and sometimes his parents. They visited his aunt and Uncle John and Aunt Shaw when they ran grocery shops in Flukeburg, and later in Surrey. Windermere became another favorite destination, a place of still water and open sky. These weren't just trips. They were early lessons in observation, in watching how people move, how silence behaves, and how moments stretch. The theater was never far away. Just across the road from his home in Lightburn Park stood the Hippodromium, known locally as Spencer's Gaff. It wasn't grand. It was wooden, tent-like, and topped with a canvas roof, but it was alive. Laurel's parents both performed there, and his father developed plays on that very stage. Laurel watched it all from close range, learning without trying. The Hippodromium burnt down in 1910, the same year Laurel sailed for America with the Fred Karno troupe. As if one chapter had to disappear for another to begin. Even after leaving Overstan, he kept returning to it emotionally. In May 1947, Laurel came back with his comedy partner Oliver Hardy. Invited by the town council, they were given a civic reception at the Coronation Hall where Laurel was presented with a copy of his birth certificate on the balcony, watched by hundreds of fans. Later, the two men visited 3 Argyle Street, Laurel's old home, posing for photographers as crowds gathered around them. By then, he was famous everywhere, but that street still mattered. As a boy, Laurel also spent long stretches living with his maternal grandmother in North Shields. His education moved with him. He attended King James I Grammar School in Bishop Auckland, then the King's School in Teignmouth. Eventually, his parents relocated to Glasgow, where Laurel completed his schooling at Queen's Park Secondary School and Rutherland Academy, now known as Stonelaw High School. Glasgow was where things sharpened. His father managed the Metropole Theatre, and Laurel began working there, not as a star, but as a student of the craft. His boyhood hero was Dan Leno, one of the great English music hall comedians, and Laurel studied him carefully, especially the restraint. At 16, Laurel stepped onto the stage professionally for the first time at the Panopticon in Glasgow. It was here he polished pantomime, physical comedy and music hall sketches. The music hall shaped his entire approach. The bowler hat, the hesitant gestures, the quiet understatement, comedy that didn't shout, comedy that waited. In 1910, Laurel joined the troupe of music hall impresario Fred Karno, adopting the stage name Stan Jefferson. The troupe, advertised as Fred Karno's London Comedians, included another young performer still finding his way, Charlie Chaplin. Laurel even served as Chaplin's understudy in England. Karno is a pioneer of slapstick, and Laurel later said Karno hadn't taught them everything about comedy, just most of it. Laurel and Chaplin crossed the Atlantic together, arriving in the United States on the same ship and touring relentlessly. In 1912, Laurel toured the Netherlands and Belgium with Ted Desmond as the Bardo brothers, performing dressed as Romans. The act ended when Laurel was offered a place in an American touring troupe. Momentum kept pushing him forward. When the Karno troupe broke up in 1914, Laurel formed the Three Kumi with Edgar Hurley and his wife Ethel. Renamed the Keystone Trio, the act leaned heavily on silent archetypes. Laurel's character echoed Chaplin, while the others mirrored familiar comic types. It worked until it didn't. By late 1915, the partnership had ended. Between 1916 and 1918, Laurel teamed up with Alice Cook and Baldwin Cook, forming the Stan Jefferson Trio and forging friendships that lasted a lifetime. In 1921, he briefly worked alongside Oliver Hardy in the silent short. Film work followed. Universal offered him a contract after Nuts in May, but studio reorganization cut it short. By 1924, Laurel committed fully to film under producer Joe Rock, agreeing to make 12 reel comedies. The contract included one blunt condition: Dolberg was not to appear. Rock believed she was holding Laurel back. When she began interfering with his work, Rock paid her off and sent her back to Australia. The films came quickly after that. Mandarin Mix-Up, Detained, Sure Don't Care, West of Hot Dog, Somewhere in Wrong, Twins, Pie, The Snowhawk, Navy Blue Days, The Sleuth, Dr. Pickle, and Mr. Pride. Half a Man. Laurel directed or co-directed many of them, shaping comedy from behind the camera. And quietly, almost unnoticed, Oliver Hardy appeared in several shorts. Laurel directed. The pieces were already lining up. The world just hadn't noticed yet. Laurel and Hardy, How Calm Men Made Chaos. Funny. From 1927 to 1955, Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy formed one of the most successful and enduring partnerships in entertainment history, but their greatness didn't come from noise, speed, or clever punchlines. It came from something quieter and far more unusual. Laurel and Hardy became famous not because everything around them fell apart, but because they remained strangely calm while it did. That calm took shape in the silent era at a moment when Hollywood itself was still unsure what comedy was supposed to be. Early in 1927, Laurel and Hardy began sharing the screen in short films like Duck Soup, Slipping Wives, and With Love and Hisses. These weren't star vehicles or prestige projects. They were routine productions designed to fill theater programs and move on. But something unexpected happened when the two appeared together. Audiences didn't just laugh. They paused. They watched. They sensed that something different was unfolding. What people responded to wasn't volume or chaos. It was restraint. There was a new energy in those scenes. A feeling that the joke wasn't being forced, but uncovered. Laurel and Hardy didn't rush the humor. They let it sit in the space between actions. Off-screen, the two men were becoming friends, and that ease carried directly into their performances. On screen, their rhythm felt natural, almost accidental, as if the comedy were happening to them rather than being performed by them. That audience reaction didn't go unnoticed. At Hal Roach Studios, supervising director Leo McCarey saw how crowds leaned forward whenever Laurel and Hardy shared a scene. By the end of 1927, their pairing was no longer coincidence or convenience. McCarey began deliberately placing them together, slowing their timing, shaping their pauses, and allowing moments to linger longer than silent comedy usually dared. What had started as a casual collaboration quietly solidified into a partnership. The Laurel and Hardy series was born. What followed wasn't an instant formula, but a gradual sharpening of instinct. Short film after short film rolled out. The Battle of the Century, Should Married Men Go Home? Tutars, Be Big, Big Business. The titles changed, but the structure held steady. Laurel and Hardy were always given a task, usually simple, sometimes embarrassingly small, and they almost always failed. Not because they were careless, but because every attempt produced a new problem. A mistake triggered retaliation. Retaliation triggered escalation. The situation collapsed slowly, politely, and completely. Their comedy wasn't about winning. It was about enduring. At the center of that endurance was contrast. Laurel's character absorbed blame instinctively. He was clumsy, childlike, endlessly apologetic. Hardy's character stood in wounded dignity, self-assured, and quietly domineering. Yet, they were never enemies. They were inseparable friends, bound together by loyalty and shared disaster. Even when Hardy scolded Laurel, the bond never cracked. The world could turn against them, but they never turned against each other. That contrast extended beyond personality and into appearance. Laurel, of average height and build, seemed smaller beside Hardy, who stood 6 feet 1 inch and weighed about 280 lb in his prime. They leaned into that imbalance. Laurel shaped his look deliberately, keeping his hair short on the sides and long on top to create the iconic fright wig. When things went wrong, his face tightened as if guilt physically hurt, his hands tugging at his hair in helpless panic. To complete the illusion, he removed the heels from his shoes, giving him that flat-footed shuffle that made him look permanently unsure of the ground beneath him. Hardy, by contrast, presented himself as composed and respectable. His thinning hair was pasted into neat spit curls. A toothbrush mustache framed his injured pride. His sports jacket strained at a single button, and his necktie became something to twiddle whenever embarrassment crept in. And then there was the look, Hardy's signature stare, straight into the camera, breaking the fourth wall, silently asking the audience whether they were seeing the same injustice he was. It wasn't anger, it was disbelief. Their humor remained intensely visual, rooted in slapstick, but never careless. Much of it relied on escalation rather than surprise. Someone's property gets damaged. The injured party retaliates calmly by ruining something else. Both men pause, survey the damage, then continue. The cycle repeats until everything lies in ruins. Big Business in 1929 perfected this routine and later earned a place in the National Film Registry. Tit for Tat in 1935 returned to the same idea, proving that destruction when delivered politely never loses its power. They remained with Hal Roach until 1940, but as the industry shifted so did their circumstances. During the war years they moved into BAME movie comedies for 20th Century Fox and Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. After completing their film commitments in 1944, they stepped away from the screen and returned to the stage, touring the British Isles and later Europe. Their final film, A Tall K, in 1950 felt less like a grand finale and more like a closing chapter written in exhaustion. Across their career, they appeared together in 107 films, silent shorts, sound shorts, features, cameos, television. And when they made their sole American television appearance on This Is Your Life in 1954, the bond was still there, visible and intact, even as time had clearly begun to take its toll. Why Laurel and Hardy walked away from Hal Roach and what it cost them. If there was one person without whom Laurel and Hardy might never have existed as the world knows them, it was Hal Roach. Their partnership didn't just grow under his roof. It was shaped there, protected there, and carefully refined. For nearly 20 years, Roach was the quiet third presence in their comedy. The man who brought them together, gave them room to experiment, and understood when to step back. Director Charlie Rogers later summed it up simply. None of it would have happened if Laurel, Hardy, and Roach hadn't crossed paths at exactly the right moment. That timing mattered because in 1926, Laurel and Hardy were not yet Laurel and Hardy. They were just two performers among many in the Hal Roach Comedy All-Stars, a rotating stock company built to feed the studio's endless demand for short films. At first, they blended into the crowd, but that didn't last. Their roles began to grow while others quietly receded. It wasn't favoritism. It was response. Laurel and Hardy communicated differently, especially through pantomime. Their movements aligned. Their pauses matched. Their bodies spoke the same language. Audiences felt it immediately. And once audiences felt it, the studio paid attention. The person who understood what he was seeing was Leo McCarey, supervising director from 1927 to 1930. McCarey didn't just suggest turning the chemistry into a permanent pairing. He helped define how the pairing worked. Alongside Stan Laurel, he slowed everything down. At a time when silent comedy often chased frantic motion and rapid-fire gags, McCarey and Laurel trusted stillness instead. They allowed moments to stretch. They let awkwardness sit in the frame. Discomfort wasn't rushed away. It was invited in. The rhythm that emerged felt natural, almost human. It worked so completely that Laurel and Hardy would play essentially the same characters for the rest of their careers. On paper, the films looked like standard studio collaborations. Roach employed writers and directors such as H.M. Walker, James Parrott, and James W. Horn. In practice, however, Stan Laurel was everywhere. Laurel didn't just adjust scripts. He rewrote entire sequences. He encouraged improvisation during filming, then meticulously reshaped scenes in the editing room. By 1929, he was effectively the team's head writer, presiding over sessions described as chaotic, competitive, and gleeful. Writers tried to top one another. Laurel tried to top them all. Oliver Hardy had no problem with this arrangement. He was content to leave the writing to his partner. His view was straightforward: the physical work was demanding enough. The falls, the mud, the repeated punishment. Hardy believed he earned his pay the hard way. Laurel, meanwhile, became so deeply involved in production that many historians now consider him an uncredited director. Regardless of who officially sat in the director's chair, Laurel ran the set. Even Roach admitted that if Laurel didn't like an idea, it simply didn't happen. That understanding wasn't debated. It was built into the studio's culture. For years, that system worked beautifully until it didn't. In the 1930s, tension crept in between Laurel and Roach. Not because of creative differences, but because of contracts. Roach had always maintained separate agreements for Laurel and Hardy. And when disputes arose, those staggered contracts became a fault line. Eventually, Laurel's contract was terminated while Hardy remained at the studio. The rupture wasn't just professional, it cut deep. Hardy was temporarily teamed with Harry Langdon for the 1939 film Zenobia, and the studio even discussed launching a new series around him, tentatively titled The Hardy Family, pairing him with Patty Kelly. Laurel didn't accept the situation quietly. He sued Roach over the contract dispute. For the first time, a partnership built on trust and instinct was tangled in legal language. In the end, the case was dropped and Laurel returned to the studio, but the atmosphere had changed. The first film after the reunion, A Chump at Oxford, carried an unmistakable undertone off-strain. Saps at Sea followed soon after, and it would be their final film for Hal Roach. The separation that followed was deliberate. Laurel and Hardy believed they could reclaim their creative freedom elsewhere. In 1941, they signed with 20th Century Fox, and in 1942 with Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. On paper, it looked like an upgrade. Bigger studios, bigger budgets. In reality, it was a shock. At Fox and MGM, Laurel and Hardy were no longer collaborators. They were hired actors, placed in BP picture units, and initially barred from contributing to scripts or improvising. The freedom Roach had allowed vanished overnight. Ironically, the films were still profitable. Budgeted between $300,000 and $450,000. They earned millions at the box office. Fox continued making Laurel and Hardy films.